Hello and welcome back to the Tiberium Theory Crafting series, this time on the USA and the formation of the GDI. This is take 2. I had been using a software called NVIDIA Broadcast, which is something that's supposed to help in real time change and remove problems like background noise and stuff like that, but without a certain amount of load on my graphics card, it doesn't really work, so I just took it off and boom, we have much better sound. Anyway, back into the video. With the last video, we covered the involvement of the Chinese Communist Party in the Tiberium Wars, and in this video, we cover the involvement of the USA in the formation of the Global Defense Initiative. On first inspection, this might seem like an odd question to ask, as the formation of the GDI was by the order of the United Nations. But that needs to be examined a bit, as does the question of the existence and ignoring of NATO, another treaty organization that might have been in a good position to defend the West from the Brotherhood, but that will be answered in another video coming in a little while. Today, our topic is the USA, and we must of course begin in the distant past, as the core origin of the GDI lies in the 1980s, and before, in the Second World War, and the concept of large Allied blocs. In the Second World War, with the introduction of the United States of America into the raging war, the balance of power was changed fundamentally. What was once an industrial powerhouse supporting both sides nominally, during the war through various institutions, both public and private, was supercharged. And the arsenal of freedom was born. Effectively taking over leadership of the Allied powers from the British, the USA got the chance to once again be a part of an alliance whose influence stretched across the world, touching everything. Americans' arms flooded into every Allied state and touched every continent in the effort to eradicate the Axis. With the conclusion of the war and the bifurcating of Germany, the USA, now the sole remaining undamaged power from before the war, competing against the Soviet Union, got a look at what their future might be as the leader of the free world. With the proliferation of nuclear arms, the United States' dominion was unchallenged, and the Cold War began, starting with the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MADE, a term that meant if any one side in either bloc used nuclear weapons against each other, they would obliterate each other. NATO was established and the lines were drawn in the sand. The United States, once again the leader in the power bloc, through the mind of President Ronald Reagan, produced the idea of the Star Wars project, or the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. The idea posed by the SDI was to make nuclear weapons obsolete by layering the United States and her allies with layer upon layer of defensive structures, lasers, and defensive systems to make the use of nuclear weapons against the West impossible. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, the technology was just not there, nor was the funding or the impetus really there in the West to begin once everyone noticed the imminent decline of the Soviet Union, so the project was mostly shelved. Ultimately, the Union fell, and the path to victory was not through arms per se, but through the outspending of the opponent, the superior means of countries in possession of a well-regulated capital-based economy. But the legacy of the SDI was not to be totally forgotten, like in our timeline, as you will hear about in a moment. No, with the fall of the Soviet Union, a new enemy arose, forming around the brutal and charismatic new leader, posing himself as Cain from the Abrahamic story of Cain and Abel. This presented an entirely new challenge for the world to take up, especially with the introduction of Tiberium to the economies of the world. One problem, the age of Reconstruction was over. No longer was the USA rebuilding the shattered remains of the West, guarding over it for a possible invasion by the communists. Many countries, like Britain, France, and the newly reconstituted Germany, and recently added to the G8 countries, Russia, were not under the complete dominance of the USA. The situation had changed, and many of these countries would not simply be told what to do by the United States president anymore. No, then President Bill Clinton reacted to this truth and the need for the potential continuation of the Cold War state by announcing, secretly, to the gathered G8 countries that the time had come for a new alliance, not headed by any individual nation, but by a committee from all the G8 countries, a military for the West, by the West, in the face of overwhelming monetary and military power of the newly constituted Brotherhood of Nod. They needed the Strategic Defense Initiative, but for the whole of the world. On paper, this was the president offering a new vision for a democratically governed military for the defense of the free world, an act of ceding in some way his leadership over the West in favor of a club of nations that could direct itself, an idea particularly interesting to the European Union, who in this time and in real life has put out many feelers about the creation of a European supranational army. But this was just him playing politics. The reality, of course, would be much different, as the USA provides 22% of the funding for the United Nations budget every year, and the greatest rival of the United States, Russia, was now a puppet state controlled by the Americans. Seeing as nations under Kane had likely removed themselves from the UN, a tremendous amount of power now rested in the hands of the true leaders of the free world. This would be, Clinton thought, in reality, a US-led coalition that would cement the US's place as the dominant nation on the world stage for decades to come. Time would prove him both correct and incorrect, but that is a thought for another time. In the meantime, the United Nations voted, with the leadership of the G8, for the formation of the Special Operations Task Force ECHO, which would eventually evolve into GDI, the now Global Defense Initiative. In the intervening years until 2019, the outbreak of the First Tiberium War, massive amounts of money was poured into consolidating the reach of the GDI, standardizing forces, and developing new technologies such as the ion cannon, part of the original SDI mandate for the anti-nuclear missile systems, and the refining methods for Tiberium, which would become the single greatest source of funding for the entire project as the green crystal proliferated. The United States began to pour its massive budget into the project, very easily exceeding the budgets of the other constituent countries by many times. And, by way of method of any political apparatus, the GDI became deferent to the United States' interests. Extranational entities, like the GDI, are just as dependent and therefore deferent to the needs of the ones holding the purse strings. With the outbreak of the war, USA was in the prime position in the organization, with Americans leading in almost all positions of the GDI military, from the Navy to the Air Force to generals on the ground. This trend would continue for many years to come, even after the American Republic would cease to exist entirely. Unfortunately, while the president controlled the purse strings, the situation across the world became increasingly out of hand until after the events of the firestorm crisis, when the world was officially split into thirds, controlled by the remnants of the Brotherhood of Nod or the GDI. All national identities were superseded into the supranational quasi-states of the GDI or Nod, and the USA died, to live on in the leadership of the somewhat democratically run crisis organization of GDI that would continue far out into the future. And as long as there would be Tiberium to clean up from any part of Earth, as long as Kane lived to threaten humanity with his terrorism and like ideological poison, GDI would continue to exist, becoming the government of humanity. At the end here, I'd like to say I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any idea that might strengthen or reduce the strength of my argument, or you just want to start a conversation, please comment it down below. If you like this version too, please do tell me, because I enjoy how it sounds a lot better than I did before, and I'd like to continue doing these and redoing older videos that have this problem into the future to give the best possible experience to the viewers. If you can come up with something awesome in your argument, I will host it as a follow-up video and credit you heavily. If you like videos about Tiberium, Red Alert, or in the future, CNC Generals, then then why don't you subscribe and hit the bell icon? I post once or twice every 2 weeks. If you really like the content, consider supporting the channel by sharing the video around or using the Patreon link. No pressure to do either. I love you either way. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.